The difference is the hugely technologically achieved by the human race difference of possession of nuclear weapons. We now have 9 states who own nuclear weapons. We have 2 distinct aspirants. I think we might have 10 because I think Iran has built a nuclear weapon. And we're walking into this as if we think we're going to get out of it, each of us, both sides. Chinese less so probably because they don't want a war, but because they're winning. Why would you want a war if you're winning? But we're walking into it as blindly as those wooden-headed, leaden-headed leaders did in 1914, as if it's going to be over easily and quickly and we'll be the winner, and not true at all. In fact, I don't think the human race is going to be a winner.
Hello, I'm Arn Menconi, and thank you for joining another episode of DeepFocus. You can find my work. I'm a journalist. I'm a former elected official. I'm also an author of the book Lied to Death, the Global Corporate Mafia, and you can find my work at my website, arnmenconi.net, my Substack, Arn Menconi. We have a very special guest. I'm sure many of our viewers are very familiar with our next guest, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He's a United States Army retired from 2002 to 2005. He served as Chief of Staff for Secretary of State Colin Powell, and he was in the room during the preparation of the February 2003 UN speech that made the case for the Iraq War. He spent 23 years since then telling the truth about it. Before the State Department, he served for 31 years in the Army in Vietnam, in the Pacific, and as Deputy Director of the Marine Corps' War College. He now teaches national security at William & Mary and is one of the most unsparing critics of American militarism inside the American establishment. In recent weeks, he's called the Iran war a global crisis, warned that the U.S. military is being utterly contaminated, and said he is ending his career with deep dismay that what he is watching his country become. Colonel Wilkerson, thank you for being our guest on DeepFocus.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I've listened to a lot of your recent interviews, and so I want to frame it and start off with, are we in World War III?
I think very much we are. I think it's been creepingly, but those of us who watch it closely, and there's quite a few of us, military and diplomatic and otherwise, who have been watching it closely and have been, from various and sundry ways, predicting that it was going to be certainly a regional conflict, which Zelenskyy has just made it. In your face just made it. It was before that, but he's put it in our faces now, entering the war in Southwest Asia as he has. But we've also been of late of concern that it is going to be more than regional, more than, for example, from Tromsø in Norway all the way down to Chabahar Bandar Abbas at the southern end of the Persian Gulf in Southwest Asia, and be global. And the ramifications of that are significant because, as I've said repeatedly, the difference between all empires in the last 3,000, 5,000, if you want to count it that far, years of human history of all those empires, and there are many, there are hundreds of empires, some of them well-known, some of them not. None of them, as they were going down, as I think the American empire is now, none of them had nuclear weapons. It is a new technological phenomenon that we invented, of course, ourselves. And that means that an empire going down can arrest that downward movement in one fell swoop. And frankly, many of us don't believe that this particular leadership would stop for a moment in contemplating that, and perhaps future leadership might not stop from contemplating that. It is a way that no other empire in history, not the Persian, not either of the Roman empires, not the Ottoman, not the Russian, not the ones that go back many, many years, the Mughal, Genghis Khan and his Mongol. None of them had this capacity. None. Zero. We now have it, and that's very frightening.
Well, Colonel, I said before we went on the show, the first time I interviewed you was in February of 2015 after spending 10 days with Daniel Ellsberg at his home in Berkeley, working with him on his book on nuclear proliferation. And also, we did an oral history of how America lies to go to war. And I still have the notes that I took while I was interviewing you, and it just shocked me. You said, Arn, America is an empire in decline. And like all empires in decline, the greediest get most greedy. Could you imagine that 11 years later, how greedy the greediest have gotten? And if so, what have you seen that you couldn't have contemplated? Just, it seems like 11 years ago was 100 years ago.
It does. That's a very astute observation and clearly reality. We have descended in the last decade plus, at a much more accelerated rate and much more into the depths, if you will, than I ever thought we would do. I clearly thought I would not live to see what was apparently coming, but I am living to see it. And that's very dismaying because it's much more profound, if you will, when you're
And what
still
are you
alive.
seeing that is so frightening to you that you couldn't have
What I'm
imagined
seeing
seeing?
that's truly frightening is this leadership, this group of grifters, charlatans, sycophants, billionaires, and others who are either in the government or behind the government, typically called the deep state. And there are people that are actually, I think, interested in what you and I were just inferring earlier, and that is a cleansing moment on the planet. And that cleansing moment would come from, they think, a limited use of nuclear weapons. I've got news for them, and Dan would have news for them too, Dan Ellsberg. You don't use nuclear weapons on a limited basis. We may get to a point where Putin demonstrates that you can in the theater of war that's developed in Ukraine, but I'm not even sure that that will be withstood in terms of a response that escalates and then escalates and then escalates. We're at a point now where nuclear weapons have become basically a thing of the cognoscenti. And I'm talking about the people in the labs, the people in the military structures of the world, not just us.
Right.
They have become merely weapons on the battlefield to be used, and probably to be used in serious ways, even a first use, for example. What we're working on right now with this trillions of dollars that we're going to spend on modernizing, securitizing, and suretizing, the fancy words the labs use, our nuclear complex, we're actually looking at the potential for a first strike capability, which we, of course, could launch and then live through any retaliation because our first strike would be so devastating. Um, this is something that never would have occurred during the Cold War because the ideology, the thought we developed about nuclear weapons was, as you are well aware, portrayed probably best in that movie that had the gentleman at the end riding the atomic bomb down and going Yahoo as he waved his cowboy hat, Dr. Strangelove, and the movie that surrounded that. We've forgotten all that. We have forgotten that. We've forgotten that we were building bunkers, some people in their backyards, stocking them with survival material, that the President of the United States actually signed a pamphlet that went out telling you how to build a bunker in your backyard should you want to. I used to show that in my seminars at William and Mary. Students were stunned. You know, you really did this sort of thing? Yes, we really did this sort of thing. We really had nuclear drills. We put our head between our knees and looked at the symbol in the corner of the room where it had a big brown box that was stacked with supplies for the Holocaust when it came.
Right.
We've lost all that.
Well,
Americans don't think about it anymore.
When the Ukraine war broke out 4 years ago, I was talking to Daniel Ellsberg, and he said, Arn, this is going to be a 10-year war. And everybody at the time would have argued against that. This started out, and let's not try to even use any references to what Trump said it would be a 4-week war. John Mearsheimer is saying it's going to last until January. Others are saying it'll last for several more months. What's your prediction of how long this war would last?
I think we're into a new
And
medium.
I'm sorry, may I interrupt? I keep finding
Sure.
myself speak linearly about it's not a war of Israel and the U.S. against Iran. This is multilateral, and it's happening both economically and politically. So
Absolutely.
this is far beyond what we could all grasp on how it's operating on so many different layers, and how China and Russia are involved. Ukraine, as you pointed out, we're turning into Oprah Winfrey. You know, you get a nuclear weapon, you get a nuclear weapon. We're trying to make a deal now with Saudi Arabia to give them nuclear weapons. So how long do you think this could last first?
I think we have to look at the things that people like me have been saying all along. To a certain extent, they've been very accurate. And the accuracy comes in when you talk about this being a much more global struggle than anybody would suggest, and anybody was suggesting at the start of the special military operation. What we have going on is a struggle between the rising empire in the world, and I hesitate to call it an empire because it's not a typical empire. It's an empire of economics, an empire of financial and monetary, social, building, construction, power. And that's China. It's like a magnet pulling 2/3 of the world towards itself. It's reversing the movement that preceded it, which brought imperial power out of the East. That's where it predominantly was, through Europe and over to America. It's reversing that. That power is now going back to where it came from originally. And China is the magnet for it. But there are other countries that are involved in it now because of our ineptitude, strategic and geopolitical ineptitude. Russia, China, and Iran are in a massive complex that represents a huge portion of the world's population, a huge portion of its potential and its real GDP, and is exemplifying this movement of power in our face. Do any of the members of his administration understand what's going on? Not really. I do think they have some people behind them in the shadows who understand it to a certain extent and are influencing them with regard to that. But what we have going on right now is the potential, very real potential, for the war in Ukraine, the war in Southwest Asia, idiotic though they are. They're still going on. They don't show any sign of lessening anytime soon. In fact, they show every sign of spreading. And what they are doing is establishing a regional theater that could rapidly go global, that exists all the way from the Arctic. Yes, the Arctic, where we are taking actions to thwart China and Russia's new efforts to solidify the Northwest Passage, if you will, the long link that it passes along Russia's northern coast, down to Chabahar and Bandar Abbas at the southern end of the Persian Gulf. So we have a theater of war that is developing for anyone with any military expertise that cares to look at it, all the way from the Arctic Circle, down through Finland, down through the Balkans, down through Ukraine and that bloody-minded war there, and all the way down to Southwest Asia and the Persian Gulf. That's where the theater is, and that's what the contention is. That's where China's base road initiative, so to speak, is hitting the opposition to that BRI from the West, led by NATO and some very leaden-headed European leaders in Paris, Berlin, London, and elsewhere, and participated in by not just a leaden-headed, but a clearly inept leader in Washington. So you've got this entire conflict going on with no one on the West side really understanding the profound depth of it, other than perhaps, as I said, some of these people behind the scenes who are contemplating this and wondering whether or not they should jump ship And if so, when? And you've got people on the other side who maybe like Putin and maybe like the regime in Tehran understand some of this and understand that they are pillars in it and becoming increasingly the pillars on the winning side. But otherwise, it's just happening because it's happening. And it's like 1914, if you will. That's the best thing I can compare it to. Every party in 1914 wanted what was coming, really, if you look at their leaderships. The British wanted it because they saw their empire disappearing unless they did it. The French wanted it because they saw the same thing. The Russians and the Germans wanted it because they saw that they were winning, so to speak, both in the population struggle, the power struggle, other things that benefited them were they to expand and grow even further. So we got World War One not because we walked in it stupidly, we did in terms of the immediate leadership, but in terms of this was building and it was going to happen. Oh, by the way, most of the leaders on both sides thought it'd be over in 6 months. Of course, it wasn't. It was a bloody mess. It was the worst war the world had ever seen until World War II came along, which was just a second chapter of that. Well, we're on that same path again. The
Yeah.
difference is, the difference is the hugely technologically achieved by the human race difference of possession of nuclear weapons. We now have 9 states who own nuclear weapons. We have 2 distinct aspirants. I think we might have 10 because I think Iran has built a nuclear weapon. And we're walking into this as if we think we're going to get out of it, each of us, both sides. Chinese less so probably because they don't want a war, but because they're winning. Why would you want a war if you're winning? But we're walking into it as blindly as those wooden-headed, leaden-headed leaders did in 1914, as if it's going to be over easily and quickly and we'll be the winner. And not true, not true at all. In fact, I don't think the human race is going to be a winner.
And Colonel, as a professor of history of war and strategist, how does the U.S. get out of this war? After the deja vu all over again with the MOUs with ceasefire, no ceasefire, ceasefire, no ceasefire. General, I'm sure you heard General Wesley Clark recently said that we have to stay in this war, we have to fight this war. I haven't heard anyone explain how can you back out, end this war now that we've gotten this far into it. Iran has become much more powerful. They can hold out longer than we can because of the way their society is set up, their government is set up. They control the Strait of Hormuz. Yemen is now controlling the Bab el Mandab, and it's. I just don't see how there's an off ramp for the U.S. at this point. And my follow up question will be: let's follow the money. Maybe this is just a money making machine, and this is the ultimate design behind all of this.
There's no question the answer to your last point is accurate, but that's a tactical answer. It's an answer that doesn't really stop any of the momentum that you just described. And I am in agreement with you that we have led ourselves, Donald Trump has led us, into this war of choice, which is the latest development in the kind of panoply I was painting, without an exit. And he is trapped now. He's trapped by all manner of things, tactical, operational, and strategic. He's trapped by his own character, which will not allow him to back up 1 inch unless it's profitable to him. And I mean profitable in both ways, political and monetarily. He's trapped by the partners he has, most notably Bibi Netanyahu, who is a genocidal murderer and who is backed and enabled by Donald Trump in the United States. He's also trapped now majorly, he was before, but now majorly by Zelenskyy, who has decided to expand the theater of war, if you will, from Central Europe for him and Ukraine all the way down to Iraq and to the war in Southwest Asia for obvious reasons. because he feels like if he does that, he'll get more support from Donald Trump and from the Europeans. So we have a trap that's been set very carefully by circumstances, and a trap that's been set by the character of our president, who not only doesn't even understand where he is and what's happening to him, but is eager to duplicate or even intensify the tragedy that he's causing. Let's just look at some of the other ways he's trapped. He's trapped by the fact that the two key factors with regard to this war in West Asia, which is his choice, his war of choice, the two key factors, the nuclear program in Iran, already settled, I think, in favor of Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz. There's no way he's going to regain control over the Strait of Hormuz. He can say he's going back to the MOU. It's not going to work. Iran is in the catbird seat, strategically speaking. So he's trapped by those two very, very in-your-face strategic factors, the Strait and the nuclear program. I don't even talk about the other things like reparations and, lifting of sanctions and so forth, because it's just not worth talking about. This is never going to happen. And then he's trapped also by the fact that Netanyahu and Zelenskyy are here in this country. They're here in this country because they're both criminals, and the one wants indemnification from Trump so he can get reelected again to continue being a criminal, the world's arch criminal in my mind, certainly the world's arch perpetrator of genocide. And Zelensky's here for a similar reason, and both of them have Trump essentially around their finger. And not because necessarily he wants to do, but because it so far has been very remunerative for him and his family, and because he doesn't know how to get out. And then last of all, he's trapped by his own character, which I just alluded to. And his character is such that that's all he cares about. He doesn't care about the country. He doesn't care about his MAGA base. He doesn't care about his cabinet. He doesn't care about any of that. What he cares about is making vast sums of money for him and his family. And he cares about ensuring that his reputation, if you will, in the world is solid and golden. So we have a leader who is encased in his own mistakes and doesn't have an idea how to get out, and is grasping right now at straws. And that grasping alone might complicate this and bring it to some kind of very, very antagonistic and not good for America and not good for the world conclusion much faster than it otherwise would arrive. And so we're stuck in this. He can't extricate himself, and because he can't extricate himself, neither can the warring parties, despite his promises, of course, to do so.
Well, I want to take a little bit different angle on this. And when Ellsberg asked me, Arn, how do you know so much about this? And I said, Dan, have you not watched The Godfather Part 1 and 2? Now, everyone starts off as a two-bit hustler, and they come to power, and then their sons become senators and bankers and lawyers. So I have a master's in business administration. I worked for developers in the 80s. I worked for savings and loans in the 80s. And I have to keep bringing back what John Kenneth Galbraith talked about. You can't talk about the politics without the economics. So I wrote down something, a little heavy lifting here, but it will be nothing for you. And that is the traditional petro deal. Saudis priced oil in dollars, recycles the surplus into treasuries, has been visibly fraying. BRICS local currency trade, Saudi drift towards China. Iran kicked off the SWIFT rail. But at the exact same moment, we're building a replacement dollar-pegged stablecoin. Tether alone now holds $141 billion in U.S. Treasury, bigger than Germany's Standard Chartered projects, and the market hits $2 trillion by 2028 and generates up to $1 trillion in new T-bill demands. Howard Lutnick, our Commerce Secretary, who lived next door to Jeffrey Epstein, owns 5% of Tether through Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor custodies its treasury reserve, and a court filing this month says he's managed to kill tougher regulations while his firm was banking them. The Genius Act, which was written by I think it was Bo Hines, who was put in place by David Sachs, helped shape the locks that the Treasury demanded into law. So here's the question. Is it possible this so-called war in Iran is less about Iran's nuclear program and more about disciplining the last holdouts onto the dollar system while the private replacement architect, the Ludnick tether pipeline, gets built? Are we bombing to buy time for the privatized petrodollar?
You could make that argument in the short term, and you could make that argument convincingly, but I think it's a false argument, and I think it's going to fall apart, and it's going to fall apart sooner rather than later. And here's why I say that. Right now, 2/3 of the world's commerce and 2/3 of its, according to recent global polling, people are directed at Asia in terms of their favoritism, in terms of their outlook for the future, in terms of their realization that the number one economic power in the world now is China. They're right in that. They're probably going to achieve even greater solidarity after this West Asian war, because what have we done but added to the vast landmass of Russia, the largest in the world under state leadership, and China, one of the largest in the world, Iran, something no one ever thought would happen, but it has. We now have a country the size of Western Europe, a country with enormous wealth and riches were they exploited properly, allied with Russia, a country with probably more of that than any other country in the world still left afoot, and China, with the massive amount of resources and wherewithal it has economically. It is the number one economic power in the world now, and Xi Jinping has just made a decision, and the decision was articulated. It was articulated in Mandarin and in the voice of Deng Xiaoping. It said, we are the number one power in the world in almost every component you can think of, except one, and that's the world financial system. Now we are going to take that. And we're going to take that by slowly but surely substituting the renminbi, the Chinese currency, for the dollar. And doing everything that means, which means getting rid of SWIFT, getting rid of the sanctions the United States uses so viciously across the globe now on some 2 billion people, and getting rid of the United States as a financial power altogether in terms of its sway in the world. This is going to happen. There's no question about it in my mind. The question in my mind is, are we going to permit that? Are we going to see this finally for what it really is? A quiet, unassuming, if you will, world supported. 2/3 of the world in polling now supports China as opposed to supporting the United States of America. In fact, that 2/3 very much so despises us, thinks it is that we are the number one threat to their children's future. Not China, not Russia, not Iran, but the United States of America. This has all developed over the last 10 to 15 years as we have abandoned international law, abandoned the world, killed people on the high seas without due process. We have become a rogue state. This is what has happened. Once we realize this to the tune that we should realize it, and I don't give much truck to Wes Clark, because I thought when he first came out and said what he said, he was sort of saying that he understood this. I don't think that after listening to some of the other things he said. And I know him fairly well. But once this is a full realization on the part of this empire, I have grave doubts that we'll refrain from trying to stop this momentum of power movement, which is inexorable. It's going to happen. Instead of trying to accommodate it and deal with it and work with it and deal with the crises we have in this world, like climate and nuclear weapons and no treaties, we're going to fight it. We're going to fight it tooth and nail, and we're going to fight it to the death. And that's where we are right now, with an incoherent, incompetent, sycophantically served leader in the White House who doesn't understand any of this and is exacerbating it majorly every day.
And I agree with your argument, and where I question whether or not it falls apart is that's where the countries are going, that's where the economies and societies are going, but the individuals, the hustlers, the gangsters, the criminals who are making all of this money, the Ludniks, the Trump, the Peter Thiels, etc. There, that goes back to what you said to me 11 years ago. The greediest get most greedy. They're short term. It's like Wall Street. They only think in first quarter, second quarter, third quarter earnings.
What happens
And
if there's no fourth quarter?
well, I don't, and they don't. They usually go and take their golden parachute and go somewhere else. But the
Yeah, the people in
the
the past who've been these people, the robber barons, if you will, of the world, the global robber barons, the Rothschilds and others like them, the J.P. Morgans and so forth,
mhm,
usually jump ship. They figure out a new place to go in order to
mhm.
maintain their perfidy.
Argentina,
And
New
yeah,
Zealand, yeah.
but I don't. The globe's too small. It's too
Right.
small now. I'm not sure you can do that, and you're
I
certainly not going to be able to escape these mushroom clouds.
uh, the and I think well, I don't think sociopathic mindsets think in terms of anything other than how much. I mean, Donald Trump, since he came on the scene in the early '80s as a developer, but I I, I guess what I'm trying to separate here is what you just laid out there seems to be one that I embrace in terms of where is, as when Wayne Gretzky was asked, how did you score all those goals? He said, easy, I go to where the puck is going. And that's where the puck is going. But I think individually, and I think where the legislation, if it's the Clarity Act, if it's the Genius Act, if it's that BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity, which once thought, and J.P. Morgan, that once thought that crypto was a Ponzi scheme, are now releasing or selling and making and manufacturing all their own stable coins, and they see this opportunity, and it's hard to connect it into where we are with the war in Iran, but I want to ask you, I want to shift gears here and go back to something that you've said before. You've said you're ending your career with deep dismay, that friends of 40 years in the security establishment tell you that they can't believe they've lived to see this. I'm a father of two. One of the reasons I keep doing the show with is because I don't know what else to tell my kids. What do you tell your children, grandchildren, and your students? What's the honest advice from a colonel who's seen it all to a parent, young officer, or a citizen who wants to resist but don't know where to start?
Interestingly enough, I don't have to tell my grandchildren, of whom I have four, or my children, whom I have two, and they're all grown and university educated or further, except for one who's in the middle of college right now, my youngest grandson. I don't have to tell them anything because they watch my podcast, and I get comments all the time from them. One is a Air Force, soon to be an Air Force captain on active duty. My son is now retiring from the Air Force after a full 20 plus year career. Um, my daughter was in the Army. She's a farmer's wife now, employee of the NSA too. I don't have to tell them anything because they see what's happening. In fact, her husband is probably as dismal in his projections of what he thinks is ahead as I am. So I've got a rare family, if you will, in that sense. I don't say I don't get pushback from them from time to time, and particularly from one granddaughter who doesn't like to hear the bad things about the world and likes to keep rosy and comic most of the time. But she understands how serious it is. And I think I would say that what worries me most about what's happening as a human being is I see the prospect of a continued human existence on this planet being in question. And I see it
Mm-hmm.
from a very, shall I say, on the one hand, scientific perspective. And I also see it from the perspective of power in general and how power operates in the world. I said to one person this morning, for example, is there no other experiment in the world like us? I'm not a religious man, fundamentally not a religious man in the sense of that formal term. But are there not many other experiments in the many, not single, many universes we know now exist? Probably there are. Are there other mentors of these developments, or is this all accidental? Who knows? But we can't be the only ones. But we are going to be not one if we're not very, very careful over the next half century. One of the things is nuclear weapons. The other is what is happening in France right now, what is happening in Spain right now, what is indeed happening across the globe if anyone cares to stop and look. The
Mm-hmm.
climate is moving rapidly and changing so dramatically that we are going to find it by mid-century or shortly thereafter extremely difficult to live. There are some French who would tell you right now they're finding it extremely difficult to live. It's going to be 104 degrees in the middle of these forest fires in France today. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you can't make this stuff up. We are really in the midst of a possible civilizational extinction. It's that clear.
Right.
And like I said, maybe there's some other experiments going on somewhere else. Good luck to them. I hope they're having a better time with it than we are. But we are flirting right now with the extinguishing of what we know as human life on what we know as this planet. And it's that serious. And people who don't want to think about it, whether they're my grandchildren, my children, or whatever, they're welcome to that prerogative. But you need to at least take a look and try to ameliorate what is happening. That's my message.
Thank you for talking about that. I've been arrested 7 times, several for climate and several for anti-war, and we do not talk enough about you cannot live 2050 with 9 billion people on this planet and have 2 degrees Celsius. It's virtually impossible.
We've done the Center for Naval Analyses. I participated in a series of simulations that were just positively frightening.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the worst case ones, by 2065, we'll have 1 billion people at our southern borders with guns in their hands trying to get water and food.
Mm-hmm. The last shift I want to make too is the elections in November. Do you feel that the Trump administration will do everything in their power in order to make sure that they do not lose Congress? If so, how will they do it? Will it be ICE in the streets? Will it be election corruption? And what are you seeing that's new and different in the loss of our civil liberties with the surveillance state that's been put in place?
Well, the answer to your question is yes, and yes, and yes. I just don't.
We need to start a support group.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't fathom. I just sent a text off to the National Education Task Force, National Election Task Force, which I was a member of in the 2016 run-up. I'm no longer a member, but I'm still plugged into their missives. And my question essentially was, do you really think what you just said is accurate? And what they just said was that there's no cheating envisioned and that we'll have this, that, and the other thing, but we anticipate that we're going to have a fairly normal election. But they're looking at what really controls elections in America, and that's the states. The federal government really has nothing to do with it. So when you start moving into that realm and saying the federal government this time around is going to have a lot to do with it, and it's all going to be inimical to democracy, then you have a different proposition. You just suggested some of that. I think we could go from the one side where they force everything so dramatically that they win, so to speak, to the other side where we have a civil war, where we have ICE deployed all around election points, for example, to make sure that minorities in particular are scared to death and don't want to go vote. And that boils down to confrontations that turn into more than just confrontations, and people go get their guns, so to speak. I think it could be from the softer option where they just bring lots of pressure to bear and force the elections in their direction, to the harder option where we start a civil war. And we have the military being very carefully fashioned right now by Pete Hegseth. And Americans don't realize this. His national prayer breakfasts and his prayer meetings in the Pentagon and his start with the Quantico address to all the flag officers, the admirals and generals in the military services. All of these things are part of a whole piece of cloth, a dynamic that they saw develop in the 6th January attempt, if you will. And it was an attempt. It was an attempt to keep Trump in office. That's what it was. They failed essentially not because the system held, but essentially because they didn't understand that the one element in any state that is being arbitrarily taken over, a coup, if you will, is the military. You must have the military on your side, or at a minimum, you must have a sort of pseudo-military, think ICE, out there on your side, completely on your side, which they're ensuring that it is. Or you have a military that stands in the wings and doesn't do anything to prevent what's happening and waits to see who's boss and then says, aye, sir, to that boss. They are going to ensure that one of those elements develops. And Hegseth is working on the one where the military, both militia, National Guard, and reserves, and the active component in their whole, respond to his wishes and respond to them even though it might be a takeover of the government. So that's what I see happening that's really worrisome for me. I think that might be a product of a civil war that would have an even deeper and more profoundly bloody provision associated with it, because you would have parts of the military taking the side of the administration and parts of the military fighting that part of the military that was doing that. So you'd actually have a civil war within the military. All of these things are possibilities the American people are utterly asleep to right now, utterly
Right.
asleep to. They don't realize how much in danger is certainly the democratic constitutional nature of our republic, how much it's been in danger since Trump raised his right hand.
And
And
specifically,
yeah, and what
and
that might mean for
specifically
their futures.
when you look at who is heading up all of the different departments, if it's going to be the Attorney General, the National Security Advisor, the Department of War, the court system, whatever game that they have that we don't know yet out of their playbook that they play either before or after the election or both. And then the thing that scares me the most is the fact that if we're on our way to merging our defense budget with Israel in
Well,
technology, and we
those
have
are the two.
Palantir. I
Those
mean,
are two provisions, 219 and 224, I think they are. What those provisions do is they legalize the treason of Jonathan Pollard. And people ask me, what do you mean by that? I said, read the chapter in Cy Hirsch's book about what Jonathan Pollard really did to get himself put in jail. And he should have been hung by the neck until dead, really, in terms of treason, because he's the biggest traitor we've had in a long time. And now he's free because of Trump, and he's living in Israel in a life of ease, as I understand it. But what he did is being legalized. That treason, that treachery is now being legalized by these two provisions of the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. That's
and
unconscionable.
are you telling the audience that the members of the United States Congress are functionally working for a foreign government?
Yes,
And
many
if
of them,
so, which ones?
enough of them to get things passed. Yes. Do all of them know how deeply they're in it? For example, does Mark Warner, my senator, know how deeply he is in this, whether he is knowledgeable of it or not? I can't answer that question. Tim Kaine, my other senator, I can't answer that question either. But I can answer the question that Tom Massey has answered, a Republican, resoundingly, and that is they're all owned, bought, and paid for by a foreign state.
What haven't we covered that you want to make sure that our listeners are following?
I would say the number one thing I'm worried about right now is the immediate consequences of what's happening with Zelenskyy pitching in with Netanyahu as a member of the party in this huge tapestry of war that's developing, and what we could do as citizens to alert the legislature more profoundly to the peril we're in if we keep going on this path. I see, from my perspective here, very close to Washington, I see some legislature, some awakening within the legislature. I see Republicans even who are questioning things they weren't questioning before. I see Democrats waking up to the fact that Israel is a massive liability to this country, not an asset. I see all of that happening, and I also see that happening with 40 and unders in America in general. But it's taking so much time. It's moving so slowly, so incrementally, which is usually good. It's the way the founders, for example, designed our government. They didn't want precipitate action. They wanted action that was reasoned and thought out and slowly evolving. Well, that reasoning and that slow evolution is inimical to our interests right now. People say, well, you're calling for a civil war now, aren't you? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I am saying that Thomas Jefferson, I think it was the one who said the tree of liberty needs a little nourishing every now and then with the blood of citizens and tyrants. What did he mean by that? Well, he meant that what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence about when governments become oppressive, they can be overthrown. What indeed Hamas meant when it conducted the operations on October the 7th, which was in essence, we're sick and tired of this occupier who doesn't obey any of the rules and is moving to inexorably kill all of us eventually. We're in our right to rise up and take action against them. They're absolutely right in that. Absolutely right. And yet most Americans would condemn me for saying that. Certainly the legislature, most of them would. And yet it's the truth. So how did we get to the point where the truth doesn't resonate and lies dominate everything? Very carefully, with a lot of liars, a lot of money being made from the lying, as you intimated. But we need to get out of this. We need to get out of this grip of that attitude and that purpose.
I don't
Trump
think there's a silver
exemplifies.
bullet, but I would say, where's our leaders?
Yep,
Where's our true leaders?
that's
You
the
have to
question.
have a bell cow in a moment like this calling for the type of protest, the type of action that we need. Now, in the almost hour that we've talked, viewers, Colonel Wilkerson has pointed out that we're at World War III. It could end up being a forever permanent war. We have treason and treachery going on with our Congress. The economy is going to crash, and climate change is going to have the final say in all this. So it's, I'm sure, I'm trying to be a little cynical here, but I want to thank you so much for speaking the truth and laying it out there, because I believe that if you go into a doctor's office and you don't want them to tell you that you have stage 1 cancer when you have stage 4 cancer. And the more we know the reality of where this is at, and to put a fine point to this, you pretty much just articulated that there's a better than 50-50 chance that the Republicans are going to keep the House and Senate. And if they do, this is just what we've seen in the last year and a half, 2 years, is going to actually just accelerate even faster.
I'm afraid you're right.
And And if people don't realize that they have to exercise their civic duty beyond just voting and making sure that they're standing up, we stand on the shoulders of people who've died so that we could have the freedoms that we now have. And I think we can all find power in that. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing so much of your time with us. It's been very powerful.
Well, thank you for having me. And hats off to Dan Ellsberg, even though he's not with us anymore.
Well, I'm sure his spirit is. And thank you, listeners. Thank you for listening to another episode of Deep Focus. Again, I'm Arn Menconi. Larry, where could we find your podcast and your other work? I know
many of them are at the Eisenhower Media Network. Just Google it. You'll find it.
Okay. And you're on Judge Napolitano's show on a regular basis. And
right.
I want to thank you. Please, if you've liked the show and you've taken the time to listen, you care deeply, please share this with your friends and family. Leave a comment and subscribe. I'm Arn Menconi. You could find me at arnmenconi.net or Arn Menconi on Substack and on X. Thank you.